Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what's often called the single biggest challenge to India's development, unemployment. And we're going to use some great material from a leading economics text to really understand what's going on behind the headlines.
So, what's on the agenda? Well, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll kick things off with the big picture, then we'll get really specific on what unemployed actually means. After that, we'll look at the problem in both rural and urban areas, and finally, we'll wrap up by digging into some of the hard data.
Right off the bat, this quote from our source really sets the tone, doesn't it? It tells us we're not just talking about some minor economic issue. We're talking about what could be the main roadblock to India's entire growth story. Okay, so let's start there. Let's really get into the broader context of this challenge and figure out why it's seen as so absolutely critical for the country's future. You know, at its heart, this isn't just about spreadsheets and economic models. It's a human issue. Our source really makes it clear that unemployment is just a tragic waste of human potential, especially when you think about India's massive youth population. These are the very people who should be driving innovation and growth. Now, to really get our heads around this problem, we need to be super clear on our terms. So, what does it actually mean to be unemployed in an economic sense? Let's break that down.
Okay, so here's the formal definition. And the key thing to notice is that it's not just about not having a job. It's this very specific combo. You have to be in the working age group, you have to be able to work, and you have to be willing to work, but you just can't find an opportunity.
And this slide right here illustrates a really important distinction. See, voluntary unemployment is when someone chooses not to work, but that's not what we're talking about today. Our focus is on involuntary unemployment. That's the situation where people genuinely want jobs that simply do not exist.
So how do you measure this stuff officially? Well, in India, the National Sample Survey Organization, or NSSO, has a specific rule of thumb. They count someone as unemployed if they're working for less than 14 hours a week. It's a really crucial line to draw because it helps separate being totally unemployed from being underemployed.
All right, let's start to get more specific. How does this problem actually look on the ground? We're going to start in rural India, which is, of course, where most of the country's population still lives. Out in the countryside, you mainly see two different kinds of unemployment. First, there's seasonal unemployment. As you can see, that's when people are out of a job during the off-season for things like farming. And then there's this other, much sneakier problem called disguised unemployment.
I mean, just think about it for a second. Farming in India is so incredibly dependent on the monsoon, right? So for huge parts of the year, a giant chunk of the workforce just isn't needed. Our source points out this can leave people without work for as long as 5 to 7 months every single year.
Now this brings us to this really fascinating idea, invisible or disguised unemployment. This is a weird situation where it looks like people are working, but if you really analyze it, their individual work adds, well, nothing, no real value. The economic term for this is zero marginal productivity.
And this image comparison from the source material just shows it perfectly. On the left, you've got a field that's crowded with workers, but look to the right. You see the exact same job getting done just as well, but with way fewer people. All those extra folks on the left, they're the disguisedly unemployed. And check out this example from the textbook. It makes the idea so clear. If 5 workers can produce 10 quintals of a crop, and then you add 11 more workers, and you still only get 10 quintals of the crop, well then those extra 11 people have zero marginal productivity. Simple as that. Okay, let's switch gears. We're moving from the countryside into the cities. And as you can probably guess, the unemployment challenges here look pretty different. They're shaped by things like education, industry, and just the whole hustle of an urban economy. So, in the big urban centers, the problem kind of splits into 2 main buckets. First, you've got educated unemployment, which is a huge concern for young people. And second, you have industrial unemployment, which itself has a bunch of different causes. And this really points to a major mismatch happening in the urban job market. You've got more and more educated young people graduating every year, but the economy just isn't creating enough of those skilled, white-collar jobs to keep up. So you end up with a lot of graduates who can't find work that actually uses their qualifications. Now, inside that industrial bucket, joblessness can happen for a few reasons. There's technological unemployment, think robots replacing assembly line workers. You've got frictional unemployment, which is usually temporary, caused by things like a strike or a factory shutting down for repairs.
Cyclical unemployment goes up and down with the economy's boom and bust cycles. And finally, structural unemployment. That's when the whole economy shifts and the skills people have no longer match the jobs available.
So, we've defined the problem, and we've looked at all the different types. Now let's zoom out and actually look at some numbers to get a sense of the scale of this whole challenge using data right from our source.
All right, this table here gives us a snapshot over an 18-year period. You can clearly see the total labor force just growing and growing. And right alongside it, you see the number of unemployed people, which you'll notice bounced around between about 7.5 million and 11 million.
But, tables can be a lot to digest. If we just pull out that unemployment rate and pop it into a simple bar chart, the trend becomes way easier to spot. You can see the rate, that's the percentage of the labor force without a job, it stayed in a pretty tight range, peaking here at 2.4% back in the 2004-05 period, according to this data. So imagine this, a country where millions of young, educated people are ready to work, hitting the job market every single year, but they find the doors to opportunity just aren't open. That's the reality of India's unemployment challenge. Today, we're going to dig into this really complex issue and understand not just the big numbers, but the human stories behind them.
All right, to get us started, let's ask a really simple but, powerful question. Just how wide is the employment gap when you look across all the different states of India? The answer? Well, it might just surprise you.
Okay, let's dive right into the data. A government survey from 2015-16 pretty much paints a picture of two different Indias. On one hand, you have states like Gujarat and Karnataka, where unemployment is incredibly low. We're talking just 9 and 15 people per thousand. But that's only half the story, and the other half is pretty startling.
Now, this is where it gets really eye-opening. Look at the other end of that spectrum. In a state like Tripura, that number just skyrockets to 197 unemployed people for every 1,000. That is a massive, massive gap. It shows that your chances of finding a job can depend pretty dramatically on where you happen to live.
So these numbers paint a really stark picture, right? But they don't explain the why. To really get it, we need to unpack the causes. So why does a problem this widespread and this varied even exist in the first place?
Well, one of the biggest drivers is this thing called jobless growth, and it's a total paradox. See, India's economy has been growing, especially in some high-tech areas, but that growth just hasn't created enough new jobs for the millions of people who need them. The economy gets bigger, but the number of jobs just can't keep up.
Another big piece of the puzzle is this choice. Do you use human hands or do you use automated machines? You'd think, in a country with over 1 billion people, that industries would be powered by that huge workforce. But instead, a lot of them have moved towards using machines and technology, replacing people with robots. This drive for efficiency has an unintended side effect. It pushes people out of the very jobs the economy is supposed to be creating.
And that choice kicks off this powerful cycle. Let's follow the steps. It usually starts out in the countryside, right, where farming is seasonal and good jobs are hard to come by. So this pushes a constant wave of people to move to the cities, looking for work. The problem is, this huge influx puts enormous pressure on city job markets, which can't absorb everyone. So ironically, it just makes unemployment worse in the very places people went to find an opportunity.
And finally, you've got this fundamental mismatch. First, there's a skills gap. The training people get often just doesn't line up with what industries actually need. Then, there's an expectations gap. A lot of educated young people are really holding out for white-collar office jobs, and they'd rather wait than take up something more hands-on. And when you layer a steadily growing population on top of all that, well, you've got a perfect storm for unemployment.
So we've explored the causes, but what's the actual impact? I mean, what are the real consequences of having so many people out of work? Let's move on and look at the ripple effects that spread across society. And the damage is really twofold. On the economic side, it's a huge waste of human potential. It fuels poverty and makes that gap between the rich and the poor even wider. But socially, the costs are just as bad. Unemployment can really tear at the fabric of communities, leading to tension and unrest. And for the person going through it, it's so much more than just a lack of a paycheck. It can be a crisis of dignity, of purpose. This is a problem that really touches every single part of society.
Now this is a challenge that governments have been trying to solve for decades. So let's turn to the government's playbook and take a look at the history of policies designed to fix this.
This timeline shows a really clear evolution in strategy. For decades, the main focus was on creating jobs directly,
especially in rural areas, with these massive programs that would guarantee a certain number of workdays. But as the economy changed, it became clear that just providing manual labor wasn't a long-term fix. The whole way of thinking had to change.
So this is the crucial point, this big pivot. The strategy has shifted away from the government acting as the main job provider to the government acting as an enabler. The new focus is all about empowering young people with the right skills and actively encouraging them to create their own opportunities through things like self-employment and starting their own businesses.
And that brings us to our final section, which is all about the future of work in India. The current game plan is focused on building a skilled and entrepreneurial nation, literally from the ground up.
This quote from a 2015 national policy just perfectly captures the new mindset. The goal is to encourage entrepreneurship as a viable career option. See, it's not just about funding or training anymore. It's about changing the culture, changing how people see careers, and positioning entrepreneurship as a powerful and respected choice for India's youth.